going to motivate the discussion a little bit, because a lot of people bring some preconceived notions about REST and REST design to the table, and I kind of want to lay the position where I am and my understanding of sort of what the consensus is amongst the REST community. And then we'll spend some time talking about URIs and the names that we give things. A little, very, very short introduction on error handling, mostly because it's kind of easy to do something really stupid, and I want to make sure you don't. And then we'll go through some ideas about representation design and versioning. All right, so this is kind of what our idea of a REST API is. It's really just sort of like this glue that maps between a use of an application and the code that we use to service it. And different applications may exercise different portions of the API, but we tend not to think of it as its own thing. And that's the first step that I want you to take away from this, is we absolutely have to start thinking about the REST API as its own thing. A lot of the tools and the frameworks and the things that we use are designed to make it easy to produce and consume resources in languages like Java and other programming languages. But if you take the code to REST API binding a little too literally, then your API is going to become exceptionally fragile. And that's what we want to get away from. So the real idea is a properly designed REST API, whether you're using XML or JSON or some other representation form, is largely independent of the implementation that you use to produce it. And if you do it well, you should be able to take the same API and move it to another implementation, and clients shouldn't know the difference. Just like if your web page shifts from Apache to Tomcat to WebSphere to whatever, right? Your clients, the browsers, don't care, and they're broken. They're not broken when this happens. So we bring our experiences with Java API development when we talk about REST APIs, and we end up writing documentation that says, like, if you invoke this, and then this, and then this, and then this, something will happen. And that's also kind of the wrong approach, because that will give you systems that work, that will give you systems with a certain amount of flexibility, but it also means that the clients are a little too tightly coupled to your particular implementation. And we'll talk about that in a minute as well. A really, really, really good sanity check as you're designing these things is to ask the question, WWBD, what would browser do? Okay? And you will find yourself recoiling in the realization that you're doing some silly stuff when you think, all right, if a browser hits a new website, does it stop and say, hold on, I have to go read the API documentation before I can learn how to interact with this thing? It does not, right? So why are we building RESTful APIs that require the same kind of knowledge on the client to understand how to interact with the backend system? It's not that you don't know things. It's that the coupling is to the expected representation that comes back, not necessarily the layout on the server. And the goal of a proper, fully level 3 hypermedia design that we'll talk about is to allow the clients to learn what's available from the representation that comes back. Just like your browser, you point it at something it's never seen before, and it says, I don't know, they said all you can do is log in. So then the client interacts with the representation, logs in, and then the browser goes, oh, well, now it says that you can access your account. A lot of people go, yeah, that's great for user-driven things, but not APIs. And the reality is, that's kind of a red herring, right? An agent or a spider can act as a user and look for links with certain types and find them and discover them and interact with the RESTful API just like a person can. But that really sort of hides the fact that we could have in these different clients, browser-based clients, phone apps, any kind of client, even another system interacting with our APIs, and it should work exactly the same way. So we have this framework that Leonard Richardson gave us called the Richardson maturity model, not necessarily as a measure of where you have to go, but more as a way of discussing the level of the number of web technologies that a solution uses and how it sort of conforms to the vision of REST. Keep in mind, the goal here is not to be RESTful. I don't want that to be the takeaway. The goal here is to build systems that display certain characteristics. and the constraints and the choices and the design considerations that go into a REST API are designed to elicit those properties. So when Restafarians get all, that's not REST, they mean well, right? What they're trying to say is, you're making a shortcut here that may seem expedient now, but you'll pay for it later in some way. So, you know, cut them a little slack. They do mean well. And they're generally right. But that's not to say you have to go all the way to level 3 right now. And I never encourage people to have that be the goal, but at least to understand what that goal brings. So when we look at a system, and we decide what is its attitude towards information resources, what is its attitude towards HTTP as an application protocol, not a straw. Like SOAP generally treats HTTP as a straw to send messages across. And what is its support for hypermedia? So those are the 3 counts that we have. And if we look at SOAP itself, it's no, no, and no. Which doesn't mean that SOAP is a bad technology. It still has its uses. But it's not REST. And then these REST versus SOAP religious wars just are kind of stupid, like most religious wars. So a lot of people come to REST and go, okay, I get it. I can put a URL in something and invoke it through my browser. That's cool. It's marginally cool, and certainly not the goal. And the problem with that is, if you rely on only what the browser allows you to do, then you're going to build a subpar system, because the browsers don't allow direct idempotent requests for using puts and deletes, because the people on the HTML5 working group decided, you guys don't need that, when they actually serve very interesting purposes. So the goal is not to make it easy to invoke things through your browser. The goal is to build systems that have certain characteristics. Just simply slapping a URL on something generally does not do much for you. Most APIs that are RESTful, that we'll see on the web and that most people build, are really only level 2. They respect information resources. They treat HTTP as an application protocol for manipulating those information resources. And they might even support some notion of content negotiation. But we know that they're level 2 because when they make changes, their clients break. Or they put versioning numbers in the URI as a means of preventing the clients from breaking. And neither one of those is how the web works, right? If you go to a news source and you say, show me the headlines, you get back some results. And then tomorrow you come back and you say, show me the headlines, you get back some results. If we had to bookmark and sort of say, like, I'm only going to see this as my headline URL, and then you change what comes back, I will never see that. I will never see the news of the future because I'm tied to the identity of the past. And so this notion of versioning being important has more to do with the coupling in the API than it has to do with any kind of requirement. And a lot of the things that we think require versioning changes really don't. If we get our clients to build systems that ignore things they're not expecting, then the server can roll out new capabilities that the clients simply won't take advantage of, but any client who wants to take advantage of the new capabilities will roll out in the near future. But what we've done is we've separated the simultaneous deployment of both clients and servers, because again, what would browser do? It would have failed. The web never would have worked if every time we had a new web server or a new layout, we needed new browsers as well. So we want that amount of flexibility. And a big part about what REST brings to us is predictability about how the system works, regardless of what you're doing. And this is the final what would browser do question I want you to take away is, does the browser care if you're hitting a financial website or a news site or a chat board or some kind of game system? And the answer is no, it doesn't care about any of these things. So this idea that our domains are so much more interesting and complicated is again nonsense, right? We have capacity to manage the gradual rolling out of new capabilities, but it does require commitment to some of the larger principles here. So then finally, hypermedia is the level 3 notion here. And this confuses people, but it's kind of strange that it does because everybody understands it. You understand how your browser works. You understand that you learn about HTML. You discover new capabilities. Your browser can download JavaScript and run it in a client and sort of extend itself in the behavior that it has. But what it's doing is it's not really caring about where you point it. It's caring about what comes back when you point to it. So the browser reacts to what it learns. It's not saying, I'm a super sneaky, intelligent browser, and I know what's going to come back if I hit this website. And that's the difference. We write applications that behave like the latter, but we want to write applications that behave more like the former because they will be more resilient. Now, there are trade-offs in this, right? There are abstractions and there's flexibility, and this means that not every system is going to fit nicely into a REST API. If the cost of creating TCP/IP connections is too high for what you're doing, then you're going to want to build some kind of high transaction messaging system or something like that. But for the most part, we can apply these ideas very, very generally. Just like the web and browser technology can be applied very generally as well. So, what about the names? Everybody thinks that the name of the thing is so important. And there's all of this sort of folklore. Oh, it's got to be a noun. It's, you know, it can't be verbs. And that's generally good advice, but people kind of misunderstand or overstate the importance of that. And we'll see that in some design decisions a little bit later. The point is, I don't want to have to care about the structure of a particular URL. I don't want to have to care too much about what this one thing does. I just want it to behave predictably if I ask for it, if I try to mutate it, if I try to remove it. So the characteristics of a good long-term identifier is that it is global scope. It will resolve the same in any context. It means the same thing in any context. And what this ends up doing for us is this allows you to create your own website, and you to create your own website, and you to create your own website, and we just don't worry about conflict because we are protected by the authority that the domain names that we're publishing into protects us from. So we get completely interoperable identifiers when we use global names, and we get the sameness. The thing that comes back is the same. We also want to disambiguate your URIs from my URIs easily, and so part of the reason why these are character-based is because we can just do simple string comparisons. And we can write them down and we can print them on walls and napkins and business cards and things like that. And it's very easy for us to very quickly decide, is this the same one as that one? But the thing that I think we don't give enough credit to is the fact that these identifiers that are global and disambiguable are also resolvable. The name of the thing is how we interact with it. And this is a compelling property when we start applying it to the information more arbitrarily. If you think about like an ISBN number or something like that, it does have global scope because you've gone through the registration process, you've paid the fee, so the ISBN system can make sure you're not going to have the same number as somebody else. But it's not resolvable. You don't know what to do with it. You have to find a service that knows how to interact with it. And that's kind of a drag. Being given a name and saying, here's the thing I'm referring to, and allowing you to just pull on it, that's pretty cool. So what we actually have is a naming scheme. The URI scheme is a scheme for naming schemes. And it was actually reverse engineered from where we started, which was on the resolvable names. The web emerged with a certain view of making documents available on the web. And then people that were involved started to say, you know what? We want to refer to things that don't live on the web as well, things that aren't documents. I want to give names to people and concepts and things like that. So they reverse engineered a lot of the ideas from URLs into URIs, but defined a scheme that was extensible and yet consistent. And what this does for us is this gives us the ability to introduce new naming schemes down the road and to map existing naming schemes into those naming schemes, but it all parses the same. So we don't have to have custom parsing for the structure of names because we have this naming scheme. But the problem is we suck at naming things, right? We produce systems that have things like CGI bin and .do and .php and who cares, right? The name of the technology should not be used to identify the resource. Why? Because you guys go to conferences and learn about new technologies and go home and run off after the new shiny object. And there's nothing wrong with that. But if you don't then curate the stuff that you had, then those URLs become less interesting. And the value of good, long-lived URLs is that they will draw attention. They will be like flypaper and get people interested in the things that you're doing. And I hope I have network connectivity back here. I'll give that a chance to resolve. So people in like the library space, people that deal with long-term ideas about information who aren't susceptible to the constant flux of technology change like we are, they're like, forget you guys, we need a good naming scheme that's stable. And so librarians and people like that like to have names that 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 50 years from now will still be good, stable names. But what did they give up in the process? They gave up resolvability. So now I have to go look up that thing. So your homework assignment, what I'm asking you to do is to create URLs that behave like URNs. Good, long-lived, stable identifiers. So this site that I want to take you to here is called Retriever. And it's a good example of what happens when there's stability in your information. Much better, thank you. So if you go to Flickr and you use their organization scheme towards their resources, you'll say, find me pictures with blue sky. And if people happen to tag it with blue sky, you'll find pictures with blue sky. But if they don't happen to tag it, you will not find those pictures. If, however, I come up and I say, look, I want pictures that look like this, then they can come back and find pictures that look like that. Now what's going on here is that these guys are some Austrian researchers who spidered Flickr and found references to the images and downloaded them and then ran them through a series of algorithms that identified color histograms and did edge detection and used that for indexing the images. But they don't have copies of the image. They don't keep copies of that stuff around. They keep references back to where it came from. So when I present something similar, it says, all right, well, let me find things that are sort of similar to what you provided, look in my index, and then go back to where the information came from. That is what we want to do with our stuff as well. We want to have information that's useful outside of the context in which we create it. And the only way we're going to do that is if we have some thought and consideration given to the identifiers of the things that we're creating. So they have longevity beyond our immediate need. And one way to do that is to build URLs that behave more like URNs. What this gives us also then is the ability to have addressability of all of our stuff, right? Not just documents, not just static documents, but static documents, dynamic documents, arbitrary data. And in this case, REST is just another type of thing that we can address. And it's about the information that it produces or consumes, not the fact that it's a service. In general, we don't care about services, which is a weird thing to say after a decade or more of service-oriented architectures. What we care is that a service produces something or consumes something, and the resource abstraction subsumes that notion. So I really don't care about the distinction between invoking a service and what it produces. I can give it a name, I can map it into some kind of behavior, and I can produce a result. That's what I care about. We're not going to spend much time talking about today, but one of the things that the semantic web does for us then is to introduce this idea of names for non-network addressable things. I can give myself an identifier, and then I can connect myself to a document or to a data set as the person who created it. And in doing so, I can use standard global disambiguable identifiers for my entities, as well as my relationships, which opens up a whole new world for us. But we don't have time to talk about that right now. So I go through and I want to create a web service for finding the employees in a company, produce a URL like this. What do we think? Good URL, bad URL? Will it produce the data? Yeah? Okay, so it's at least some notion of a good URL. Right? It does something. Why would a Rastafarian get cranky about this? So? I agree with you. I'm just playing devil advocate here, right? The reason they would get cranky is because this is now a special URL. This is a special URL that only does one thing. And I would not imagine using this URL to update employees or to delete them or to remove them. So I would have to set up another endpoint to do that and another endpoint to do that. And suddenly the client is coupled to too much knowledge about what this specific URL does. And that's the problem. So if instead we think of this as /server/employee as the set of all employees, I now have a way to identify and resolve our entire employee base. Now, if you work for a very large company, you may want to have pagination in there, but that's something the server can drive as well. It can say, here's the first 10, the first 100, and then you just ask for that thing. You don't even have to know what the pagination scheme is, but you can then go back through them, come up with your own schemes as well. Now, the question is, once we have the set of everybody, then we want to introduce arbitrary partitions of that set to talk about classifications based on status, or individual employees, or employees with degrees, or employees who have children, or employees who participate in intramural sports programs, whatever, right? Anybody you can imagine wanting to carve up that set into an interesting business concept, giving it an identifier, and allowing people to just pull on it. What's the distinction between these two URLs? Okay, so will they return different results probably? Probably the same results. The difference between them is this URL or the identity of the resource terminates at the question mark. And we only have one resource depending on however many queries and attributes and things that we're going to ask of it. So the set of all hourly employees and the set of all full-time employees and the set of all seasonal employees isn't really modelable using this approach, because the difference between how we interpret that URL inside the handler and outside the handler is driven by the fact that the resource is terminated by the question mark. If I ask what is the resource that's being asked for, it's employee. Now, it's a subtle distinction, but if instead I take the second approach, this now is an identifier that will behave the same. It is a partition of the set of all employees based on status, and it will be treated the same both inside and outside of the handler. But we like this arbitrary ad hoc querying capability. We don't have to give that up. And in fact, there are times where that key value pair filtering is preferable to something like this, because not everything represents a hierarchical relationship. And people shove non-hierarchical relationships into things like /lat/long. And there's no relationship between latitude and longitude like that. So we'll come back to that in a second. All right, so obviously I want to partition on various subsets, but I also want to talk about specific employees. And it would be perfectly legitimate to have one group of people working on a RESTful service that produces this kind of partition, and somebody else working on URLs like this. And is this a good URL? Sure. It's a perfectly reasonable URL on its own with no larger context. Is this a good URL given the fact that somebody has already done this partitioning? No, because now we have this accidental conflict, right? What comes after employee? Is it a status designator or is it an identifier? Certainly we can, in our configuration, say, all right, if it's /status, then go here. If it's not, then go somewhere else. So it's not that we can't solve the problem. It's that we don't want to think that hard about it. We don't want to accidentally back up into this kind of ambiguity. And we don't want to prevent Stephanie Tatis from working at our organization because she might really rock. And if we have this ambiguity, then we have this problem. So if we think about these as sets and set identifiers and vectors through information spaces, then we can introduce a new partition scheme by introducing a new vector component. And so the vector component here is identity. I'm going to spin off this way to talk about identity. I'm going to spin off this way to talk about status. And now it's much less likely that I'm going to produce URLs that are going to accidentally conflict, accidentally be ambiguous. Now, there's a form of URI that Tim Berners-Lee has been popularizing called the matrix URI. And it allows us to mix and match the hierarchical and non-hierarchical components with potentially ad hoc queries. I can talk about the set of all color maps at a particular latitude and longitude at a particular scale. But unlike the question mark query parameter approach, that is a single identifier. and it is an ad hoc, potentially, identifier that identifies the set of all maps at that location. And what's funny is what we think of as ad hoc queries at scale aren't really ad hoc queries, right? Somebody wanting to know, like, what are good restaurants in this zip code, or find me good Indian food within 10 feet from where I am, or 10 blocks of where I am, in a place like San Francisco or Los Angeles or New York, right? That question probably gets asked an awful lot. And so our potential for caching and reuse and these sorts of things are also empowered by this. Now, I still don't necessarily want clients to have to know how to build these things up. We will allow them to do ad hoc querying, but I probably want to introduce a new concept like the set of all new maps that will be somebody's starting point, and then from there they'll get back some kind of representation that will link them into our naming scheme, and they will discover the links there, and then they can bookmark the information and come back to it. So that's our goal, is to have these things be discoverable, and I'll talk about some consequences of that in just a second. But the take-home message here is, think of these things as information spaces. Think of a URL as a vector through an information space, and you'll realize that one path might get us to the answer, but another path might also get us to the same answer. If I asked you to design an API and ask for what time it is based on the time zone you're in, you'd say time zone / PDT. Everybody knows what time zone they're in. But if I asked you what time it was in Hawaii based on the time zone, I don't know Hawaii's time zone. I can't simply ask for that information, but if I give you another path to say like time zone / state / Hawaii, I'll end up at the same result, and I will learn what the time zone is, and I will learn what the canonical link is based on time zone, but we can give people multiple paths to the same answer based on what it is that they do know. Now, because Tim is responsible for the long-term longevity of the web, he's got to get a little Debbie Downer on us and say, stop trying to parse these things. Stop trying to look at a URL and assume that you understand what the structure means. But Roy says, yeah, but there's interesting serendipity if we treat these things as meaningful hierarchical partitions. We can discover connections between things by popping up a level and getting back a collection of a thing, or discovering what options are available below. And if the hierarchical scheme is meaningful and memorable, we like the idea of bookmarking. And remembering something is just a weak form of bookmarking. So if we make these things make sense, and we make each element make sense, then these things become memorable, and then people can just ask for the information that they want. Now, again, this is not clients building them up, but if you are interacting with something and you remember what the scheme is, you can just say, hey, let's go to this starting point and ask for it directly. So Tim's point is, these could just as well be the same URL, to the same thing. Roy's point is, one of these is easier to remember than the other, and no credit for guessing which one. So when we start thinking about hierarchical decomposition and partitioning of our systems, if I wanted to provide information about the talks and the articles and the white papers and code samples and things like that that I give, that's a meaningful decomposition that's unlikely to change. So I can start there. If I want to introduce the talks that I give at this conference versus the Semantic Technology Conference versus the Museums on the Web Conference, right? That's another interesting partition underneath the set of all talks. And then from there, the talks that I gave this year at JaX versus the talks that I gave last year at JaX, also a meaningful decomposition. People often ask me, well, how come you didn't specify that as talks year conference? That could be another interesting partition. Like if you wanted to know which talks did I give over the last several years, that's the driving motivation, not what talks did you give at a particular conference over a period of years. Either one is legitimate. It's just a question of what's your purpose. So if I asked you to read and interpret this URL, just for the hell of it, you'd say, oh, the REST talk that you gave at JaX in 2012. But there's not only one JaX conference, right? If I spoke at a different one, then I might decide, oh, I no longer want to talk about just the Jack's REST conference. I want to talk about the REST talk that I gave in San Francisco. And if you just like slap another element on this URL, you've now changed that thing from being a leaf node to a non-leaf node. And that's the kind of thing where it's, if you're not careful, you will change the interpretation of something, and if people have bookmarks to it, you might break them. So one way that we can get around this is to mint URIs that are meaningful in different ways. So I can have a canonical one that says, all right, this is the link to my REST talk, and it changes over time. It changes, you know, talking to people, what they like, what they don't like, new frameworks, new thinking. So if you bookmark that, you might get something back different every single time, but it represents my latest thinking. Whereas this is a stable historical identifier that will give you back, you know, one specific snapshot of the information, and therefore is less likely to change. So that's a quick walkthrough of names, and names are important, but they're important because we want them to be stable. They're not important because the client needs to know how to build them up. Very, very quick diversion on error handling, mostly because it's easy to get this wrong. One of the things about the uniform interface in REST is that a lot of interaction can happen below the application level. We don't have to write separate code when we're talking to information about an account versus information about an order versus information about a library book. And we have the ability to express certain kind of errors in a predictable, reusable way. So you've issued a bad request. Don't try again until you fix it. You're not allowed to see that unless you log in. You're not allowed to see that even if you do log in. I don't know what you're asking for. We're having some problems. Come back later. We can have a very rich conversation in an application-independent way. But we still want to have some idea of how we're going to design our application-level error handling. So I encourage you to think about some sort of representation. And I don't care what it is, right? Whether it's JSON or XML or a document or something, right? But have some way of expressing one or more errors to allow the client to know what went wrong. Now, you may have clients that don't know how to interpret the response of what you give them, so you can come up with a fairly lightweight way of saying, here's a link to an explanation of what went wrong, so clients can discover new error handling that they weren't aware of. Hey, this is a new policy, or hey, this is no longer allowed. Those kinds of things can happen. But just if you're heading in this direction, get some consistency to how you handle application level errors, just so your API doesn't behave differently than this other department's API and ad nauseum. But the main thing I want you to do is not return a 200 response code in an error condition. And that's a lot easier to do than you would think. A lot of these annotation-based frameworks where you say the default response is a 200, if you happen to catch an application level exception that's thrown and sort of say, oh, okay, well now I'm going to set the response to be this error message and forget to set the response code to be something other than 200, then you've just told the client that they can cache the error message and it's not even worth bothering trying to fix it because you may not see the proper response. So not a huge point, but just make sure you're deliberate about how you test these things. Another thing that a lot of people don't necessarily spend a lot of time thinking about is, what does it mean to introduce suffix-based type selection? Again, through the browser, hey, look, I get HTML. Look, I get XML by just tagging a suffix onto this. I'm not telling you not to do this. And when I build systems, I support this mode because a lot of people like it. If you know that you want the XML or the JSON version of something, just ask for it. That's fine. But what you're doing, if you then commit to this specific format of the thing and pass it on as part of some orchestration, is potentially stealing somebody else's freedom to make a different choice. If you pass around a logical reference and allow people to negotiate it into XML or JSON or an Excel spreadsheet or something like that, then their tools, their workflows, those kinds of things can absolutely vary from consumer to consumer, even within the same orchestration. But if you pass around a reference to a particular format, and that's not the one that they want, then they're going to have to work harder to get it into the form that they do want. And there may not be like a discoverable way of getting from HTML to the Excel spreadsheet rendering of this. Not as important in the REST space, but once we start thinking about information resources and describing them with metadata, we've also just forked the identity of this resource. And if I have access control policies and authorship and licensing and things like that associated with a particular resource, then I now have to come up with a mechanism of tying it all together. And we have ways of doing that. It just starts to get harder. So what we can do is we can have the same named thing, and it's a conversation. Clients can say, I would like to see this report back as XML. I'm going to do some programmatic negotiation of the data. I want to get it back as JSON. I want to get it back as an Excel spreadsheet. Or I just want a rendered form. And what we start to realize is there really isn't that much of a distinction between a web page about information and a REST API. And the browser is going to ask for it back as HTML. And so if your handler just says, if anybody asks for the account information as HTML, then just give them back this web page. And we can then start to realize that the same endpoint can serve up the different forms. Not that you have to do all at once. You can pick a couple. You can pick whatever your client's most going to want. And then in the future, somebody can come to you and say, I'd like to add support for this. And that becomes an incremental extension, not, well, I got to go set up a new endpoint. That means I need to get to the data. That means I need a new handler. That I need to, now I'm forking the paths towards the information, which then starts to head us down into some circle of hell. I don't know which one. The way we do this is when we ask the request, when we issue an HTTP GET, we can have an accept header that says, please give it to me in this preferred form. And you have the freedom to give it a couple of options, although in general, you're going to say, I want it in this form, and the server's either going to say yes or no. You can also ask for particular language encodings. So give me back a German version of this, give me back a French version of this. And you don't have to have separate endpoints for that. If it's the same information just rendered into a different language, that may not be a distinction worth exporting as separate URLs. You also have the ability to ask for various compressed forms too if bandwidth is of an issue to you. But what you don't have to do is make everybody else care about these decisions. If nobody else in the enterprise really cares about compressed forms of this, but you're building a phone app and you need to be more careful about how you consume this information, that support can be added without impacting the enterprise developers at all. And if they decide that they want to use it, knock yourself out. There's nothing stopping you. Now, there is an issue. If you do vary the response based on the MIME type or the accept language or something like that, you need to tell the world that that's what you're doing. Because if you don't, then you ask for something as HTML, and I give it back to you, but I'm a caching intermediate proxy. You ask for it as XML. I'm like, oh, well, here you go. Here's the thing. And I give you back HTML. You're like, that's not what I asked for. So when you use the vary response header, and you tell intermediate proxies, I vary based on the language. I vary based on the MIME type. Then they will build a compound key for their caching index to say, all right, I'm going to put the HTML one here. I'm going to put the JSON one here. I'm going to put the XML one there. And I won't get confused if somebody asks me for a different version. So this is a very important step towards having your resources be extensible over time and to give people information in the form that they want. All right, so I want to talk about some general guidance. These are not hard and fast rules. These are just things that I've run into. I tend to design things first in XML and then add JSON and other kinds of support. Most of these ideas transcend any particular representation expression. So I'm not trying to bias you towards XML. So in this commerce domain that we're going to talk about, I want resources that have to do with users and items and orders. And I want to have some kind of workflow expressed in the representation themselves. Again, you point your browser at a server that you've never seen before, and it requires authentication or a sign-up process. It will tell you, no, dude, you got to sign up first. So we want to be able to control, you can't place this order yet because you haven't told me how you want to pay for it. So some kind of means of controlling the workflow in the representation in a way that doesn't couple the client too closely to the server's layout. And what we end up seeing, remember when I talked about the API is a thing unto itself and we want to separate it from the code that implements it? This is about establishing a conversation in the language of the domain. We are modeling the domain in this sort of beautiful, pure notion, and we're going to hide all of the crap that's in our back-end systems, which there always is, because if we don't do that, and then we fix things, and they just automatically bleed through into the API, then you've accidentally introduced a potentially breaking change, and you don't want to do that. And this is why I don't generally like the automatic object to JSON, object to XML serializers, because they just vomit out key value pairs. And if you refactor things, then that's going to change how they come out, and you want to be deliberate about that. So representation design, when I build an API, is a deliberate act in and of itself in the language of the domain, and then I worry about how to map it in. And if I have to write custom serialization, I have to write custom serialization. That's not my consumer's problem. That's my problem, but I want my thing to be stable, so I'm going to take the choice. So I talked about some of this. If you're going to use some kind of validation scheme, I would wait until you kind of understand where the representation wants to go. If you start like schema validating from day one, it's just going to be, Mitch Hedberg has had this joke that a turtleneck is like having a midget hanging around your neck trying to strangle you all day long. And that's what my attitude towards premature constraint validation. It's like it's just going to slow you down. It's not going to do all that much for you. If you then start to change how you want to represent things, then you have to change the schema, and that just becomes a slow, painful process. So spend some time getting it right. And you don't even have to rely on obnoxious things like XSD. You can have instance documents converted into like the relaxing format through the style sheets at exampletron.org. So you can take instance documents, run it through a style sheet transformation, and produce a human-friendly schema. There are such things. And if you need to go from that into XSD for tooling, then that could be an automated process. But humans should not be editing XML schema documents, even through fancy user interfaces. It's just, you've got better things to do with your life. All right, so as a first cut at a representation of, say, an account, I might give it an identifier like this. I might talk about the type of the account, the name, the address. We want to send emails to people. You know, on first blush, it seems reasonable, and you might produce something like this. But I want to change just about everything. Number one, as we've talked about, an identifier, a URL as an identifier, has the potential to be reused in different contexts. And if I just say /account, then adding support for things like all the new accounts, all the top accounts, becomes a potential conflict. So we want to introduce this identity vector component to separate specific accounts from partitions of accounts. And then we want to identify the resource in the body of the response. And if your attitude towards this is, hey, my application is talking to my RESTful API, I just went there, I know what it is, then you're missing the point that if I do have some partition, like all the top accounts or all the new accounts, I might get back a collection of pointers that says, here's where the actual account is, go get it. And this isn't just about point-to-point, you know, remote procedure calls. It's like you're discovering the relationships of links to arbitrary information. Let people find it. And not just as a link. The link is important, but we want this to be easy for the consuming developers as well. So having some kind of identity attribute on the outer element, the outer JSON object, is an important thing as well. So as I said, the team that I worked with did a great job, phenomenal job. They had never tackled REST, Spring, Agile, test-driven development, Groovy, behavior-driven development, and Cucumber before. And yet they incrementally adopted all of it and rolled out the first version in 6 months. But what I couldn't get them to do is to think about deliberate choices about the structure of the representations. So I designed the representations. They started mimicking my designs. I went away and did other stuff. I came back, and I saw in production something like this. Type equals 3. Why does it say type equals 3? Well, because that's what the service gave us. What does type equal 3 mean? Priority. OK, you know that. How is the client going to know that? Oh, they'd read the documentation. Why don't you just tell them it means priority, right? And if you change your back-end implementation and 3 no longer means priority, then things break. So make deliberate choices that are meaningful to the consumer, that are meaningful to the domain. Don't just let these little details slip in, because over time, this will make things very, very fragile, and you don't want to do that. As I said, I don't like these serializers that just vomit out key value pairs. I like to cluster things based on relation. And it'll become more obvious in a second, but as an example, things like contact information or names or those sorts of things, I like putting into its own thing. This is in part to keep things manageable, so we're not just looking at 1,000 different key value pairs, but we want this to actually be more readable. I'm like, wait a minute, I thought this was about software. It is, but the more time you spend designing your representation, the more you're documenting the representation, not the URLs, the more time developers are going to spend looking at these representations, so they should be readable. They should be easy for people to understand and sort of figure out what's going on. Now, in Agile, we have this little angel that sits on our shoulder and keeps us from over-engineering things. And her name is Yagni, and she's like, you're not going to need it. But if you're not careful and you stick too close to her advice, you can cause some problems for yourself. One example is we knew that we were ultimately going to support multiple addresses, but we knew that for the first several releases we weren't going to, right? Shipping address and billing address were going to have to be the same thing. So if we built the representation just with an embedded address element or something like that, and then moved to an addresses block that had multiple addresses in it, that would have been a breaking change. And so just trying to spend some time anticipating, even if the story that you're tackling is not, you're not going to tackle it for many months, you can imagine just having an addresses block with a single element in it, and then describing a scheme for looking at attributes or looking at key value pairs on a JSON object to say, here's how you identify the billing address, here's how you identify the shipping address, and then the client code will work the same whether there's one or multiple addresses in there. So I like you to listen to the Agni, but look to the future as well, because the decisions you make now can keep you from having to handle breaking changes in the future. So when we talk about being able to contact accounts, the goal is not to have the email address. The goal is to be able to contact them. So that's the functional decomposition of the means by which we can contact somebody. And if that's how we structure it, then it becomes easy to say, oh, well, do you want me to Twitter you when you can pick up your TV that you just bought at the store and it's ready to be picked up? Do you want me to SMS you? Do you want me to come up with whatever is new and fancy next year as a messaging scheme? So we can extend and introduce new contact types in the future. And again, if clients aren't looking for whatever comes next, then they continue to work. But anybody who wants to look for that because they know it's there, because we've published the update to our API, will be able to take advantage of it. But we get this ability to roll things out separately. And if we make functional decomposition choices, that becomes easier to do. So our cleaned up resource looks a little bit like this. It's slightly more verbose, but not terribly so. And now that it's kind of complete and I understand the structure, I might take this and then map it into a JSON representation. Again, not necessarily automatically. The idioms and the expression might be cleaner slightly differently, but now I can represent the same thing in different ways and support people for the ability to just ask for them. All right, so we learned some lessons from designing the accounts. Now we want to design information about items. So we got our vector components. We're breaking things up based on status. And what's interesting about this kind of API is that I can give you a read-only HTML rendering of this as a bookmarkable thing. And if your job in the organization is to know what's new, what we're selling, to be on top of these sorts of things, then this is an interesting business concept for you to just bookmark and come back to whenever you want. Hey, what's new? What's new? What's new? What's on sale? And you can either present it as its own thing, or you could say give it back to me as JSON and render it into some kind of gallery in your browser. But it's one data source. It's one identity. It's a meaningful business concept made available to us. And yet we also have our separate identity for individuals. So we have good URLs. We encode and identify the link. We have some other stuff in here. What did we get wrong now? You may, if you need to support multiple languages, think about tagging text descriptions at an element level. But don't go crazy, right? You really want to solve this at the document level. And as I showed, with accept language, you can just automatically tell the server, give me a Japanese, give me a German, give me a French rendering of this thing. That's probably the more appropriate place to do it. But there are times where you may want to have multiple language encodings for a description of something. Make sure to identify them so people can select accordingly. If you're targeting Quebec or Los Angeles or something like that, you may 50-50 French, English, English, Spanish. But don't go crazy on sending down 100 different language encodings for the same element. You're just wasting bandwidth at that point, and we have better ways of handling that. So, another thing that slipped in when I wasn't looking. I was looking through some traffic and some log dumps, and I thought, what the hell is that $ doing in the price element? Oh, well, the service gave it back to us. Number one, right, now clients have to parse character symbols to know here's what it is in euros, here's what it is in dollars. And that's really just metadata about a value. It shouldn't be part of the value. So we want to represent things like currency as attributes on the value. But because this slipped into production, you hope you have smart clients. Because a smart client will say, if the first character is a $, then skip over it. If you don't have smart clients, they'll just say, skip over the first character. And then when you fix it, they think everything went on sale. And you have problems on your hands. So be very, very careful about letting these sorts of things slip into production. Now, we talked about identity as a vector component, but we may not have thought enough about this. Because different communities can know things by different names. A product's SKU is generally an internal identifier. A product's UPC, or EAN, is an external identifier. And they both point to the same thing. You may need to have both of them. So you may need to have multiple vector components within even, say, the identity space. Here's the set of all SKUs. Here's the set of all UPCs. And taking the time to do this right will keep you from accidentally running into a case where this identifier and this identifier might conflict. Now, obviously, SKUs and UPCs probably won't, but it doesn't take you any time to start developing these habits, and once you do, you'll save yourself problems in the future. Now, somebody might say, all right, well, I need the ability to look up a SKU and then find its UPC. Oh, we need a service for that. No. Ask for it as a SKU, and in the representation, provide a link to it as a UPC. Right? You don't need to write custom services to do that kind of thing when the information is already there. OK, so we learned about items. We made some choices. Now we have all of our new orders, all of our open orders. I may refer to a particular order. I may refer to an order for a particular customer. For that last one, that's probably how I would model it. I'm partitioning the set of all orders through the customer view. Other people might want to say, I want to talk about a particular customer's orders. My preference is consistency in the leftmost thing will tell you what it is. Just from an expectation, you'll either get back one of these or a collection of these, depending on where it is. That you start getting into subjective things, right? And my opinion doesn't really matter there. But this is just how I would do it. So now I can have an order representation. I can have links. I have items. I have addresses. And clients can know to look for these things, not based on the URL, but based on the identity of the thing that comes back. And this is where just tagging something as application JSON or application XML starts to get a little problematic. Because no longer is this any old XML or any old JSON. It's a very specific thing. And the clients have no reason to go looking for these links or these things that we're putting in there if you just say, by the way, this is just JSON. Now, This is not universally loved in the Rastafarian community. The Orthodox Rastafarian Church does not like this at all. And they're like, only use standard MIME types. But the Reform Rastafarians, the ones who actually have to build stuff, until there is a generalized, reusable hypermedia form, this is a solution. And it's a solution that will be forward compatible. If we decide in the future that we've standardized around, there are several things being considered, and they're all very interesting, but we haven't standardized on them yet. In the future, if there is a standard generalized hypermedia form, then absolutely, that will be the right thing to do. But until then, if I hit a URL and I get back the fact that this is one of our accounts encoded in XML or one of our accounts encoded in JSON, then I know how to respond. Just like your browser goes, oh, you gave me a byte stream but called it a ping image. I know how to parse that. I know how to respond to it. So the same thing can be done here. I can tell you what it is and how to interpret it in the identity of the MIME type that comes back. We react to what we come across. We don't know, because knowing is a form of coupling. We can then decide, all right, an incomplete order should not make it, oh, hey, here's where you should submit the result. Because the server's just going to reject it. It's just going to say, nope, you need to tell me where it's going. You need to tell me how you're going to pay for it. And to avoid that, we can control workflow by the presence or absence of links with certain rel types. You can say, all right, if it's not a complete order and you ask for a resource, then I'm not going to give you the option to submit it, because I'm just going to reject it. Now, you may want to have some kind of validation service, some way of conveying what needs to be done. But in general, the presence or absence of these links, just like the presence or the absence of a login mechanism or a form to fill something out, is how the browser responds. We want to give that kind of affordance discovery, is the term the REST community uses for this, to decide what it is you're allowed to do. And then if I say, all right, well now I know I have something in my cart, I know where you want it to go, I know how you want to pay for it, then I will provide a link with a rel type of submit. The client doesn't care where it is, doesn't care where it's pointing. It just does a post or a put or whatever you decide to that thing as a way of then finalizing the order and shifting it into a submitted state, in which case I will actually charge your credit card. But we can control workflow by controlling the presence or absence of those kinds of links there. All right, so just wrapping up quickly, because I'm running out of time. I can also start to identify resources, sub-resources. Not necessarily the resource for the item, but the resource for the item in the order, or the address in the order, or the payment type in the order. Why would I do this? If I want to add a new credit card, I can find the tender section, I can find the link to the thing that knows how to accept the tenders, and I can just post a new one to it. I've just added a new credit card. I've added a new item. I've added a new address. This doesn't have to work any differently than any other kind of resource manipulation. Why stop there? I can also add identity for the items within these collections. So item number 2, address number 1, tender number 1. Why would I do this? Want to change credit card? I can issue a delete request to that thing. I don't have to know exactly how this is handled. I don't have to write custom software for doing what is really just an information resource manipulation. Obviously, I have to write the behavior in the back end that responds to a delete request to that thing. But from the client's perspective, it's not behaving any differently than anything else. And if I want to change the order or the quantity of something, I can post a new quantity to it as well. So very quickly, just to wrap up with versioning, a lot of people build level 2 RESTful APIs and encode versioning into it, because if they don't and they make changes, the clients break. And we don't want to do that. So we can reflect versioning in the MIME type as well. It's just a question of whether you need to. If you rolled out and did not have this kind of versioning represented, then you can't change the default behavior. But if somebody asks for a new version, you can be like, OK, here's the new version. If you roll out with people asking for the version 1, then you can change the default type, because the version 1 people will still be getting the version 1 of the representation. Now, this isn't to say that this is an easy problem, but it gives us tools for managing it. It gives us tools for deciding a breaking change requires a new version, and that's when we will reflect that. But if we don't have breaking changes, we don't necessarily need to rev the version number, and things should continue to work. Like, I should be able to add a link that connects an order back to its account, and anybody who's not looking for that will just ignore it. But anybody who wants to do that connection, that's a very useful piece of information. They will roll out a new version of the client to accept that. If I change an address to an addresses block, however, that's a breaking change, and I need to be careful about that. So John's famous law of being conservative in what you send and liberal in what you accept can help you make choices on how to respond to these things. When I designed these representations, I called everything that was a SKU. 6 months later, when I wasn't looking, out comes this thing that talks about SKU ID. Why did you call this SKU ID? Oh, that was the attribute name on the thing that I got back from the service. Have we not discussed this? So now our representation is reflecting things differently in different representations, and that kind of sucks. But because this is something coming from the client, I can be liberal in what I accept. I will accept either a SKU ID or a SKU, and then exert some kind of pressure out of band to say, by the way, next time you roll something out, can you drop that use of that attribute? So they'll be like, sure, no problem. I don't want to make them do that. I want to ask them to do that. And when I detect that nobody's providing this anymore, then I can deprecate it and invalidate subsequent requests. If, however, it's something that we send down and we get it wrong, then we may have to send both forms of it down until we can also exert this pressure, because simply picking one may break somebody who's expecting the other one. And this sucks. But it's a tool for doing these sorts of things. So try not to break things. Good rule. Versioning as needed. And as needed is defined as when you have breaking changes and plan ahead. So I'm happy to answer any questions, but we've also run out of time. My email address and Twitter handle are there if you want to contact me. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your week as well. Thank you very much.